Look, I can't read, but I'm here to teach you. That's how education works. And this is Sunday School. Cheers. Welcome back to my channel where we talk about books and other stuff. I'm really glad you're here, and this is the beginning of a new series of videos that I'll try to put up every Sunday, which is, at Sunday school. I thought about wearing a suit and, coming across as a Sunday school teacher. And then we did some research and found out, when you Google Sunday school, you get a lot of mugshots of criminals, and that's not the vibe I was going for. It turns out I'm too fat to wear my old shirt, so you'll just have to imagine me projecting more authority than I currently am, which is, once again, how education works. And I'll try to explain what I plan to do with this series, and then we'll go through an introductory session today before we start talking about individual books in the coming weeks. Alright, see. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion about, how reading has changed and all of that stuff, and I'll go into that. But my main goal here is to look at how we read books, how we read fantasy mostly, and all the different aspects that go into that can make us better readers. And I want to, use individual books to look at individual elements of that, and I'll always tell you which book we'll talk about next week, next Sunday that is, and so you can prepare, maybe, or not, and then you know where things are going, and then we'll find out how to actually be better readers all together, taught by me, who can't actually do it. Anyway, so that's the run-of-the-mill. I'll already let you know the next book, the first book that we'll talk about next Sunday is The Summer Tree by Guy Gavriel Kay. And the reason why I chose Guy Gavriel Kay to start with is that he's not that well-known an author, but he's a very, very good author, from what I can tell, a very deliberate author in the field of fantasy, and his novels show a lot of the things that I want to look at. And a lot of us can probably experience those for the first time or go and reread them. They're also individual, most of them are standalone novels, so if you miss a specific session or don't want to look into a specific thing, we're not missing out. And that, I feel, is a good way to go about it. So, The Summer Tree, book 1 of the Fionnavar Tapestry and Guy Gavriel Kay's first published novel, is what we'll talk about next Sunday. And now let's talk about reading as such. See, recently, there's been this discussion, reading ain't what it used to be, and I don't want to go too deep into that discussion. But one thing that stuck out to me was a lot of people saying, well, reading is a hobby, and reading has changed as a hobby. And I was kind of startled by that, because I never thought of reading books as a hobby. It's just something I did. It's just something I'll do. It's I got time on my hands, I'll just go and read something. Imbibe a story, as you will. In the way that I would never consider watching YouTube videos a hobby, or watching TV a hobby, or listening to music a hobby. It's just part of my life, part of my identity, if you will. And then I thought more about it. Well, maybe reading is a hobby after all. I mean, you spend money on it, you buy books, you spend time on it, and depending on who you are, you then also spend time thinking about that stuff outside of your just reading hours, in a way. So maybe it is a hobby in a way. And I wanted to think about how to talk about that more, because one of these problems that have come up with the recent discussion and the more social media side of reading is that people start to talk about what is good reading, what is bad reading, start to compare stuff, and so forth. And I've talked about that before, that with social media there's the problem that everything is a bit of a performance. And performance can both be, theatrical or athletic, and we're shifting between those two. And I feel that's sort of the problem, because if reading is a performance, the question is what's good reading? What's bad reading? It's we need to talk about that before we can talk into how to be better readers. All right. So, let me start with an extended metaphor, and a sports-based one at that. So, it'll be bad, but you can probably laugh about me and have some fun, and maybe it'll still make sense. Okay, so, I think reading is a lot like some form of sports. Say running, or say football in the European version of football. that some people may call soccer. My point is, it's something that is very, very easy to do on a basic level. And that's great. And that's the point that I want to make. Every form of reading is good reading. As long as you read a book and you're having fun, that's perfect. That's all it is about. Which is, just like, say, running. Or it's, maybe you like to go for a run once every, I don't know, couple of weeks, and you just run through the outside world and enjoy the fresh air, the landscape, all of that stuff. And that's perfectly valid. Or maybe you meet up with some friends from time to time and have like a regular like running thing where you run with like a bunch of friends. Same goes for soccer, right? Like we all know for football, we all know how to kick a ball. It's simple. But maybe you sometimes hang out with a bunch of friends, have like a barbecue somewhere on a meadow, and someone drops a ball, and you just like run around and kick around a ball. And that's perfectly fine. That's valid, right? And maybe you actually meet up regularly with friends to train and have like some sort of fun football league kind of thing going on where you meet up with other friends and play against them and stuff like that. And that's valid. Or maybe you're a bit more serious about the whole thing. You think about like buying special running gear, special football gear. Maybe you even do sometimes run to build up your stamina or go to the gym to build up your muscles so you can be a better football player or a better runner. And that's also valid. Or maybe you're like an actual professional athlete, a top athlete. You have like a nutritionist that tells you what to eat, when to eat, how to train, what to train at what point. You study the statistics, you study like tactics and all of that stuff to be a peak athlete. And that is also valid. And that's where the metaphor stops, and I'll try to explain why reading is the same. Because see, maybe you just read on your own. You sit at home and you read a book and you're like, well, that's fun. Next time I have, time and nothing else to do, I'll just sit down in a couple of weeks and I'll read another book and have a good time. And that's perfectly valid and that's fine. Or maybe you sometimes meet with some friends and you talk about the books that you've read and, exchange recommendations and stuff. And that's really cool. That's perfectly fine as well. Or maybe, you actually read a bit more deeply and you sometimes go and check up on authors or read their biographies or do some research about a book. It's like about its background. It's like, oh, this is a historical novel. It's set in 17th century England. Maybe I'll also go and read up on, what 17th century England was really like and see if the historical novel works like that. Stuff like that. And then you talk with other people about all these elements. Or maybe you're actually a literary critic or literary scholar, and you've read your Northrop Frye, and you've read your Joseph Campbell, and you've read your Roland Barthes, and all of these people, and you can do this for a living, which, wow, wouldn't that be great? So it does have the same, scale between just casually doing this sometimes, or being a more dedicated hobbyist, or being a professional, and the more professional or more dedicated you are about this, the more additional things slip in that go beyond just opening a book and reading that book and closing that book. And all of that is fine, because as long as you read, as long as you take in information and stories, that's what it's all about. At the end of the day, it is still all about that. But there are differences. And that brings us to what makes someone a good reader. What is good reading versus what is not so good reading? And obviously, the first version is the more books you read, the better reader you are, which is bullshit. Now, obviously, reading more is always better, and it makes you faster as a reader. It makes you, more comfortable. You can compare stuff. So reading, in general, reading more is always a good idea. Reading broadly is a good idea. It's just like training. Reading is a muscle that you can train. But at some point, the question is that all? And that's where we hit the problem of meaning. See, books are not just like running miles, because books have elements to them. We get something out of it. We get meaning out of it. They usually ask one of the biggest questions, and that is, what's it like to be a human? The human condition lies at the core of telling stories to all of us, and that's what books do, and that's what we can get out of them. So there's another layer here that is not just read more pages, but it's read more mindful, read more into the text, get more out of the text, so to speak. And that, I feel, adding that depth, that's what actually makes reading more enjoyable, makes it more meaningful and more powerful to us. So the question is like, how do we do that? We can't do that just by reading more, although it helps. We also need to think about how we read, what we read, all of these kind of things. That's where we, slowly ascend into the more dedicated hobbyists era of reading. So today I'll just talk a bit about, general stuff here, and then we'll move on. All right. So, how to read. See, books have all these elements. I want to think of books, I want you to think of books sort of as a prism. On the one hand, there's light, and on the other, there's all these different colors that we can all enjoy when we open a book and look at it. And that's another bad metaphor, but, this is education. So, what do I mean? There's all these facets, and we talk about that sometimes, and you have like, I'm a plot reader, I'm a character reader, so I want to look at those facets that all books always have, including fantasy. And one of those is, of course, the plot, the story itself, the tale, the action, what happens from page 1 to page the end with all the story. And that's an easy access. It's how we consume narrative in general, because that's what narrative is. It's a series of connected actions that have hopefully some form of causality connecting them. And, that's easy. And we do that, and it can be just fun and fine to just read to find out what happens next. That's how it works. And that's great. Now then there's like another version that I personally sometimes appreciate, and that is reading as a puzzle. It's something that we find in, say, crime novels a lot. It's also something we find in some fantasy novels that are closer to the heist genre. Say, Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson is one of them, at least the first couple of Mistborn novels. It's a book where we as the reader, while following the action, try to think ahead and anticipate and solve puzzles that are built in the story. And in theory, we should be able to solve those problems like a few sentences before the characters solve the problem, so then we can be happy for having that, rush of dopamine when we got there before everyone else. We solved the puzzle. And that's a way to read books, and it's a great way to read books. Like, find out who done it, find out how to break into the unbreakable room, all of that stuff. It's great. It's reading as a puzzle. Now then there's another way, and that is reading for character. See, books are about characters. They may be human, they may be robots, they may be animals. They may be all kinds of things, but if they are fiction, there's characters, because someone has to do the things that then lead to other things that then lead to like an entire story. We need things or entities that act. Those are our characters, and we can read for them, we can identify with them, we can worry for them, we can feel for them, because they in some way represent some part of human experience that we all also have. And that helps us, think about them in ourselves. So we can, hate characters, we can love characters, we can cry for them, we can empathize. And that's another layer of reading a book, another facet, so to speak. And that is one way to appreciate books. And what's really good about all these layers that I've talked about so far is we don't need any special training for that. This is all the things we do anyway, because that's how we engage with the world. And that goes for the next two before we move to the end. The next one is reading for style. That's one that I personally am very, very prone to, because I like to play around with language. But it's basically, you read a text, you just admire how the writer, the author, put together all these words in all kinds of shiny ways. It's looking at a thing well done, a story well told, a song well performed, just admiring the craft. I personally, tend to do really dumb jokes and puns, that kind of stuff. I like playing with language myself, and I appreciate it when I read an author that does the same. Whether it's, very powerful, emotive language or just really silly jokes, it's one of the aspects that we can all do, which is just look at wow, they just did something with language that I wish I could. Which is, for example, why I love, say, Terry Pratchett, who's a master of that craft, or Douglas Adams, but also way more poetic authors. It's all in there. Reading for style. It's something that I personally appreciate. And that leads us to the last of these general categories, and that is reading for themes. Because books are not only telling us a story, they're also always about stuff, about how to deal with things, how, to deal with these situations that our characters come into when they play, when they act. That's the big question. Those can be all kinds of themes. Those can be themes of love, themes of grief, themes of loss, very different aspects of those facets of the human experience, the human condition, as philosophers would call it. And that's, that's great. All these different themes, they can be political, they can be psychological, they can be all kinds of other things. Everything, basically, that you sometimes think about vaguely can be a theme that shows up in a book. And all books have themes. All of them do. Children's books have themes. Don't worry, all of them do. And sitting back and thinking about those themes is a great way to read a book beyond all these other engaging ones, because it makes us think and take something away that we can maybe make better sense of our own existence and of our own world. That's how reading for themes works. And that's basically how we as humans can engage with all kinds of fictional texts. Which leads us to the other part, and that is reading fantasy as a genre. Now, everything I've said so far is very much about how we read books in general, fiction in general. Fantasy, however, as a genre, is special in a lot of ways. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them hopefully change over time, and that's what we'll engage with in the next sessions, but there's a few general things here that I feel are important to point out. Fantasy, for a long time, has been one of those genres that have been ostracized from mainstream discourse. We all know those situations when we tell someone that we read fantasy, they're like, oh, isn't that just for children? I just read serious books. Stuff like that. And when you look at, say, literary scholarship, you find that it took a long time for people to actually take fantasy as a genre seriously in, academia. Which means, on the other hand, that people thinking about fantasy were usually people within the genre. They were authors and fans that were working on this. It has been, for a long time, a very internal dialogue, not necessarily always well connected to the greater discourse in literature. And art is always a dialogue with other artists. That's how it works. We read books and they influence us. We watch movies, they influence us. We listen to music, it influences us. That's how art works as a dialogue. And fantasy's dialogue for a long time has been very specific and somewhat separated from other discourses, which is something we need to keep in mind. Now that means that fantasy, as literature, can do all the things that other literature can do as well. We just talked about all these facets. Fantasy can do all of these things, but sometimes it does all these things in its very own quirky way. In that regard, fantasy is very much like, an ogre. It has layers. Books have layers, pages, I guess. But you know what I mean. And that's the point here. There are different layers to fantasy that we may or may not find in other genres, but that are very explicit in fantasy. And the next couple of sessions, I will try to look at one of these layers per, I don't want to call them lessons yet, but videos. And the first one will be fantasy as a discourse with fantasy. And we'll talk about that when we look at, The Summer Tree by Gabriel Kay next week. It is a fantastic book. It's a relatively short book. You can move on and also read the next two books in that trilogy, The Wandering Fire and The Darkest Road. I'll try to keep it as spoiler-free as possible, but I may have to mention other books and stuff to make my point. In that case, if you want to do advanced studies, have a look at the Books of Amber by Roger Zelazny. Maybe just the first book or the first 5 books. I have videos about them somewhere if you want to watched those already, but take a look at those. If you have read J.R.R. Tolkien books, say Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion, that may also be helpful. Those things may come up. I'm just spoiling the next lesson here. So that's sort of the point here. So I don't know. Have a good weekend. Have a good week. Go read some fantasy. Think about it. And next week we'll talk about fantasy, how it is an ongoing dialogue. And I hope you already learned something today. And well, I'll see you next time for Sunday school. Cheers.